Hi everybody. So I hope we're all doing well today. Okay, and we are at the last leg of our discussion in your subject Philippine readings in Philippine history. So for this time, we will be looking into the history of the Philippine Constitution. Okay, and this is for my nursing and tourism students. So currently, we have the 1987 Philippine Constitution that is in effect or that is governing the country. All right, so how did we evolve to such constitution that we have right now, or what is the history, okay, of the Philippine constitution? So that's going to be the focus of our discussion at the moment, right? First, what is a constitution? Okay, so it is viewed as the wellspring of laws and practical rules that governs the everyday lives of people. Okay, so it prescribes principles, laws, rules, and tells how the government should operate. Okay, so all laws and judicial decisions must conform to the Constitution. Okay, because it is the supreme law of the land. It is the highest law of the land. A constitution is a law, but it is the paramount law. It's the highest or supreme law of the land. If there is a conflict between an ordinary law and the Constitution, okay, the Constitution should prevail, right? So again, it is a set of principles which prescribes or tells how a state or an organization should be governed. That is why for every organization you have your constitution and bylaws, right? Okay, so a constitution is the supreme law of the land which tells how an organization or an institution or a government should operate or should be governed. Okay, so if you look back at the history of the country during the latter part of the more than 300 years of Spanish rule, national sentiment grew among the group of Indios or the native Filipinos. Nationalism was awakened as a result of the Spaniards' abuses. Okay? So there were revolutions that were launched as a result of these abuses that we have experienced from the Spaniards. So you might have seen these abuses in the materials that were given to you in the history of agrarian reform and the history of taxation in the Philippines. Okay, so these revolutions were also fueled by the writings of Dr. Jose Rizal and other ilustrados or the Filipino intelligentsia who exposed the abuses of the Spaniards through their writings and who also educated the Filipinos of how freedom and equality is being experienced in other countries. So Filipinos began to clamor, okay, for independence, freedom from these abuses. And one of these revolutions resulted in the declaration of the Philippine independence in Kawit, Cavite on June 12 of 1898. Okay, so how this happened was back then when the Spaniards was defeated by the Americans. The U.S. Navy transported Aguinaldo back to the Philippines from his exile in Hong Kong. Okay, so Aguinaldo came back and declared Philippine independence on June 12, 1896. So thereafter, Malolos Congress was then elected, and the Congress selected a commission consisting of wealthy and educated individuals to draft the Malolos Constitution. Right? So it was approved by the Malolos Congress on November 1899 and was entitled as the Philippine Constitution of 1899. Okay, so this was patterned after the Spanish, Mexico, and the French and Cuban model or constitution. So again, upon the defeat of the Spaniards in the Battle of Manila Bay, Aguinaldo came back to the Philippines, declared Philippine independence in Kawit, Cavite on June 12, 1898. Okay. Malolos Congress was elected and convened. And thereafter, Congress selected individuals to draft the Malolos Constitution, which was later on approved on 1899. So it is the first Philippine Constitution which declared the Philippines as a republic. Okay, so the Malolos Constitution ushered to what is known today as the First Philippine Republic, with General Emilio Aguinaldo as the first Philippine president. So when the Malolos Constitution was presented by the Malolos Congress, this was approved by President Emilio Aguinaldo. So it was Emilio Aguinaldo who headed the executive branch of government. So class, under the Malolos Constitution, there were three branches of government. We had, or it had the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch of government. Okay, so the Malolos Constitution prescribed a parliamentary form of government for the Philippines. Okay, and the head of state is called a president, and not a prime minister, because usually when it's a parliamentary form of government, the head of state is a prime minister. But in this case, it was a president. Okay, and the executive power is vested in a president. So when we say executive branch of government, this is the branch of government who administer, who execute laws, okay, that is being legislated by the legislative branch of government. Okay, so legislative power was vested in the Assembly of Representatives of Nations. So they are the legislative branch of government. Congress was then called as the Assembly of Representatives of Nation. Okay, so they have this power to legislate laws, to create laws, okay, to be enforced by the executive branch of government. We also have the judicial branch of government, and the judicial power is vested in the Supreme Court. When we say judicial branch or judicial power, this is the branch of government who is vested with the judicial power to interpret laws, to say if an action is against the law, right? So they interpret the laws that are created or formed by the legislative branch of government. Okay, so again, under the Malolos Constitution, the Philippines was or had a parliamentary form of government. It has three branches: the executive, which is headed by the president; legislative branch of government, which is composed of the Assembly of Representatives of Nations, and their task is to create or legislate laws; and judicial branch of government, which is headed by the Supreme Court. So its task is to interpret laws. The Malolos Constitution class have salient features. Okay, so first, it declared that the state recognizes the freedom and equality of all. Okay, and it provided for the separation of the church and the state, because remember, our experience from the Spanish rule is that the church have so much say on the state or on the government. Okay, the priests were not only concerned about the religious aspects, but they can also influence governance. So when the Malolos Constitution was drafted, it saw to it that there will be a separation of the church and the state, and that there is this value for freedom and equality. Okay. Next, as what we have discussed earlier, the government shall exercise three distinct powers: legislative power, okay, executive, and judicial power. So again, legislative would be the power to create law to be enforced by the executive and interpreted by the judiciary or the judicial branch of government. So let's take a look at how the legislative branch of government is formed. Okay, so legislative power is vested in a unicameral body called the Assembly of Representatives. Okay, so Congress back then was called as the Assembly of Representatives, and it is a unicameral body, meaning it's one body. What we have now is bicameral. We have an upper house, which is the Senate, and we have a lower house, which is the House of Representatives. But in this case, during the time of the Malala's Constitution, it's a unicameral body. Iisa lang siya, walang upper house at saka lower house. And the members of the Assembly of Representatives are elected by the people for 4 years. So back then we call Congress as the Assembly of Representatives. They are elected by the people for 4 years. That's the prescription of the Malala's Constitution. We also have the Judiciary, okay, or the judicial branch of government. Judicial power was vested in the Supreme Court. So it interprets laws, okay, or interprets laws that are supposed to be created by the legislative branch of government. We also have the executive branch. Power is vested in the president, and the president is elected by the Assembly of Representatives. So it was different back then. The prescription was the people will elect the Assembly of Representatives, and the Assembly of Representatives will elect the president. So it's not going to be the people who will elect the president, but it is the Assembly of Representatives. And the Malala's Constitution did not prescribe a seat for a vice president. So there was no vice president in its prescription. Okay? All right, let's move forward. So the Treaty of Paris happened, okay, on December 10 of 1898. So under the Treaty of Paris, Spain sold the Philippines to the United States for how much? $20 million. Okay, so the $20 million was paid by the United States to Spain for, sabi ni Spain, for public buildings and the work that we have accomplished in the Philippines. You have to pay us $20 million. So the United States agreed, and Spain surrendered or sold the Philippines to the U.S. Okay, so this concluded the Spanish-American War. Okay, so the event happened during the term of President William McKinley. Okay. With this, the Filipinos were hoping to gain independence finally from Spain. However, the Malala's Constitution was not put into full operation in the Philippines because of the Treaty of Paris. Okay, so after Spain ceded the islands or the Philippines to the United States, the U.S. immediately proceeded to suppress the Philippine independence movement. Okay, so it was actually the American government who went after Emilio Aguinaldo. Okay, and the U.S. took over. It was met with opposition by Emilio Aguinaldo, and they launched guerrilla warfare. However, this was not successful. He was captured in Palanan, Isabela. So the American ruled the Philippines, okay, after the capture of Aguinaldo, and we also have the Jones Act of 1916, which promised independence to the Filipinos once we are able to form a stable democratic government. So they said, if you're able to formulate, once we see that you can maintain a stable democratic government, then we will grant you independence. So you can pattern your government under the American model or under the model of the American government. Okay? So after how many years, a 10-year transition plan was finally approved by the U.S. in 1934, okay, and a constitution was drafted, right? And this was called the 1935 Constitution. However, this was not fully implemented. Okay, so the transition plan was disrupted by World War II, okay, with the invasion of Japan, right? So we had Filipinos who resisted against the Japanese invasion, and however, we still fell. Okay, the United States fled the country. Okay, sabi ni MacArthur, I shall return. Okay, so a Japanese republic was briefly established in the Philippines. So as you all know, we have Jose P. Laurel, who was appointed as the president of the Philippines under the Japanese rule. Okay, so during the Japanese rule, we had a new set of constitution that was ratified by the Filipinos, led by the Kalibapi or the Kapisanan sa Paglilingkod ng Bagong Pilipinas, but that was not again implemented. Okay, so as we all know, the Japanese lost World War II. Okay, the Japanese forces were defeated by the Allied. MacArthur finally came back to the country, and this ended the rule of the Japanese. After which, the 1935 Constitution became operational. Okay, so that's after the restoration of the U.S. rule in the Philippines when the Japanese were defeated. So the 1935 Constitution established the Commonwealth of the Philippines. So sabi ng 1935 Constitution, the Philippines shall have a Commonwealth government. Okay, so it prescribed a principle of separation of powers among the three branches of government. So remember, under the Malola's Constitution, we have already the three branches of government, which is the executive, legislative, and the judicial branch. So the American government also have these branches. So we patterned after the American government. So sabi ng 1935 Constitution, you shall have a Commonwealth government, and you shall have distinct branches which shall have separate powers. When we say separation of powers, walang pakialamanan. Okay, they will do their own job. They shall not influence each other. Right. So the 1935 Constitution was declared the independence of the Philippines. Okay, so the Commonwealth of the Philippines shall be known as what? The Republic of the Philippines. So it shall adopt a presidential form of government. It shall have the president as the head of state. Alright, so meron din siyang Bill of Rights included in the 1935 Constitution, which was not really articulated in the Malola's Constitution. So the Bill of Rights Class D outlines the rights of individuals, what the government cannot do, okay, to an individual, and what is accorded, what's the rights that the individual is supposed to enjoy. Okay, so later on you will have another video that shall outline the Bill of Rights, because this is an important information that every Filipino should also know. Okay, so again, the 1935 created the Commonwealth of the Philippines. It originally provided for a national unicameral assembly. Sabi ko kanina, when we say unicameral, there is no upper house and lower house. Walang Senate, walang House of Representatives. Okay, so it also prescribed a president and a vice president to be elected for 6 years without re-election. So under the Malola's Constitution, if you can remember, we said that it did not prescribe a vice president. However, under the 1935 Constitution, it said that you are to have a vice president, okay, which shall serve a 6-year term with the president without re-election. Okay. So election was held on September of 1935, and Manuel Quezon was elected as the president of the Commonwealth of the Philippines. When we say Commonwealth class, it is a form of government in which the people are involved, or they have a say in governance. So a Commonwealth is a political community which is to be founded for the common good of the people. Commonwealth means common well-being. Okay, so let's proceed. So the 1935 Constitution was amended in 1940. So we have the 1940 amendments. Okay, and while the 1935 Constitution prescribed a unicameral assembly, Okay, the 1940 amendment said that we are to transition to a bicameral Congress, meaning there shall be an upper house which shall be composed of the Senate and the lower house which shall be composed of the representatives. So it limited also the term of office of the president to 4 years. So under the original 1935 Constitution, remember it was 6 years, okay? But this time, during the 1940 amendments, it's going to be 4 years, but the president can maybe re-elected, so he can continue to serve for a maximum of 8 years. Earlier, walang re-election. Now, it's got a re-election. So, the 1940 amendment to the 1935 Constitution also provided for the creation of a commission on election. So, it was the 1940 amendments to the 1935 Constitution that prescribed the creation of a commission on election. So, now you have the commission on election that is in charge during voting, during election time. Okay? All right. Okay, so after the 1940 amendment to the 1935 Constitution, we had another amendment to the Constitution. We call this the 1947 amendments. Okay, so by the way, class, during the Commonwealth period or the Commonwealth government that we had from 1935 to 1946, that was just a transitional government to prepare the country for the full achievement of independence from the United States. So during the Commonwealth government, we were allowed to have our own set of officials, our own constitution. However, our foreign affairs remained to be managed by the United States. So we were not fully independent. It was just a transitional government. Okay, so in 1946, the U.S. Congress passed the Bell Trade Act. Okay, so the Bell Trade Act of 1946 specified economic policies that shall be adopted by the Philippines once it is granted full independence by the U.S. So the U.S. Congress was saying that we offer 800 million for you to rebuild your country. So this is a rebuilding fund. So because remember, during the Japanese period, we were greatly devastated. Our infrastructures were destroyed. Buildings, houses, and roads were ruined. Okay, and we were not really developed. Also during the Spanish government, there was no development, good or great development in the country during those times. So the 800 million offer of the United States came as something that's good for the country during that time. So sabi ni US, we can give you this amount. However, you need to put these economic policies, adopt these economic policies and put it in your constitution. Okay, so you need to amend your constitution. In exchange, we will grant you full independence. Okay, so this did not sit well with the Filipinos, so because the Bell Trade Act was asking for the U.S. to have equality of privilege and rights with Filipinos in terms of the exploration of natural resources. So this would mean that we are allowing them to explore our natural resources equally as how Filipinos would do it. And it also asked for U.S. citizens to operate public utilities in the country, such as lights, transportation, water, and other public utilities. It was also asking for a free trade between the Philippines and the U.S., where there will be no restriction in the entry of U.S. products in the Philippines. Because usually when you export a product to a country, the receiving country will give a tax amount, okay, that you shall pay. Okay, in exchange, you can sell or you can bring in your products to that country. But the United States wanted us to have free trade, okay, so they can freely sell or bring in their products to the Philippines. So those are just some of the specifications in the Bell Trade Act. So ayaw ng mga Pilipino, but then we had President Manuel Rojas, who went ahead and convinced the Filipinos and the Philippine Congress to pass or to go ahead and incorporate these amendments in the Constitution, as though we needed funds to develop the country and we needed the help of the United States to develop our natural resources also, and we can always amend the Constitution if this is not really good for the country. Okay, so the Bell Trade Act was passed. Okay, and this was accepted by the Filipino people and the Philippine Congress. So this was approved on July 2 of 1946, 2 days before the granting of full independence to the Philippines by the U.S. So they granted us independence on July 4 of 1946. Okay, so what we are celebrating, by the way, is the independence that we got from the Spaniards. Okay, we're not celebrating the U.S. Our independence from the United States. Kaya July 12 yung sinaselebrate natin. Okay? So, anyway, to conform with the Bell Trade Act, we have amended the Constitution on 1947. Noong 1946, in-approve lang natin. Sabi natin, sige, we will amend the Constitution. And we did amend the Constitution on 1947. This was known as the Parity Amendment. So, the Parity Amendment granted privilege of equality between, so there will be equality of privileges between the Filipinos and the U.S. in the exploration of natural resources, and also U.S. are allowed to operate the public utilities in the country, and there will be free trade between the Philippines and the U.S. Okay, so yun yung some of the specifications. Tsaka also the currency of the dollar, si US daw magprescribe kung magkano yung equivalent ng peso into dollar. Like those things, but we will not dwell into such. I just wanted to present that we had the 1947 amendments to the 1935 Constitution. By the way, when we were granted full independence by the US, our first president was also Manuel A. Rojas. And to add to that, class, so during the Malolos Constitution, we had the first Republic of the Philippines. Okay, we had General Emilio Aguinaldo, and then after we had the Japanese Republic. Okay, we had Jose P. Laurel, and then after the defeat of the Japanese, the Commonwealth government was established, okay, under the supervision of the Americans. So we had the Commonwealth government, we had Manuel Quezon as the president, and then with the granting of the under Commonwealth government, naging president din si Manuel Rojas, okay? And then with the granting of the full independence to the Philippines by the U.S., we had the Third Republic na, okay? And the first Third Republic president was Manuel A. Rojas. Okay, so a few years after that, okay, on 1965, we had Marcos, okay, elected as the president. So before pa siya, meron ng mga past presidents. But what I would like us to see is that on 1965, Marcos was elected. On 1969, he was again re-elected. And then, okay, a constitutional convention was elected under Marcos' regime to draft a new constitution to replace the 1935 constitution. Okay, so but before the constitutional convention finished its work, okay, of replacing the 1935 constitution, Marcos declared martial law. Okay, and during martial law on 1972 of November, the CONCON finished its work and presented the 1973 Constitution to President Marcos, and that was approved on the same year, 1973. So the 1973 Constitution provided for a shift from a presidential form of government to a parliamentary system. But Okay, so what will happen under the parliamentary system na sinasabi ni 1973 Constitution is that the president shall serve as a symbolic head of state. So mayroong president, symbolic lang siya, okay, hindi siya real in power. The real in power would be the prime minister. So the executive power is to be exercised by the prime minister with the assistance of the cabinet. So he will execute laws in the country. And under the 1973 Constitution, the legislative power shall be vested in a, again, unicameral National Assembly. So, wala na yung bicameral, wala nang Senate at saka House of Representatives. Babalik tayo sa unicameral assembly. So, isahan na lang. Okay? We will not separate the National Assembly. Okay? Okay. So, when the 1973 Constitution was installed or became operational, let's fast forward to 1981 to 1984. So during this period, amendments happened in the 1973 Constitution. So one of these amendments was that the president shall be the head of state and the chief executive of the republic. Okay? So, di ba si Prime Minister yung original na nasa 1973 Constitution, but when it was amended, okay, sabi, the president now shall be the head of state and the chief executive of the republic, and he shall be elected from the National Assembly for a term of 6 years. So, the president shall not be elected by the people, but it shall be the National Assembly or the Congress who will elect the president for a term of 6 years. Meron pa rin si Prime Minister, but he shall be the head of government and not the chief executive of the republic. Okay? So, also, these amendments included the president being able to dissolve the National Assembly and call for a general election. So, ito yung isang power na binigay kay president nung amendments na ito. Because accordingly, sabi nila, Marcos wanted to stay in power perpetually. So, he wanted this kind of power to be vested in the Philippine president, so that when Congress are not in line with his likes, and he can just easily dissolve Congress or the National Assembly and call for another election. Okay? So, by the way, the head of government means, being the prime minister means that he shall be concerned with administration. He shall have control of all the ministries, like ministry, yung tinatawag natin ngayon na cabinet members. Okay? Now, and he shall also be the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. So, yun yung mga task na binigay kay prime minister. Okay? But, ngayon, real power shall be vested in the president. Okay? And the president can dissolve the National Assembly when he likes and call for a general election. Pwede niyang i-dissolve si Congress. So, ang tawag nila sa amendment na ito ng 1973 is constitutional authoritarianism. So, naging authoritarian na. The National Assembly was replaced by the Batasang Pambansa. So, Batasang Pambansa na ang tawag kay National Assembly. That's why, if you would go to Quezon City in the House of Representatives, it's called Batasang Pambansa. It is there where they legislate laws. Okay? So, another is that the president shall become the prime. So, yung sabi natin kanina, nag-exchange yung role ni si president na magiging prime minister yung role niya, and he shall continue to exercise legislative powers. The president was given the power to create laws na dapat kay legislative lang dapat. Pero dun sa amendment ng 1973 Constitution, under what we call the constitutional authoritarianism, okay, the president is authorized to legislate laws on his own on an emergency basis. So, President Marcos back then, before making actions that are authoritarian, he made sure that there is a legal basis for his actions. That's why the 1973 Constitution were amended a lot of times. So, maganda naman sa kanya, nililegalize niya yung gusto niyang gawin. Okay? However, he he became infamous among the Filipino people. Abuses were allegedly conducted by him and his administration, and a revolution was staged against him. So that was in 1986. So under the pressure of the United States, who used to back Marcos, Marcos family flew to Hawaii on exile. Okay, so doon siya namatay. And on February 25, 1986, Corazon Aquino was installed as the president of the Philippines. Okay, so Corazon Aquino at that time had choices. It's either to revert back to the 1935 Constitution, or to retain the 1973 Constitution and continue to issue laws, or just be in power by yourself, or to create a new constitution. So she later selected to have a constitutional commission to draft the new constitution for the Philippines. So the new 1987 constitution limited the declaration of martial law to 60 days, right? And the declaration of martial law has to be approved by Congress, and can also be reviewed by the Supreme Court, right? So it consisted of 18 articles and a preamble. And also, it provided or prescribed for a presidential type of government for the Philippines. And the government is to be divided into 3 branches. So we retain the executive, legislative, and judicial branch of government. And also, the 1987 Constitution declared that the Philippines is a democratic and a republican state. So by that, when we say republican state, it is a form of government where power is vested in the people, and that as a republican government, it is to adopt the ideology of democracy, which is to be guided by the principle or ideology of liberty, freedom, equality, rights. These are the principles that are to be valued.